Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Interlinked podcast, the official Neo Tokyo podcast powered by Shrapnel.
Introducing Shrapnel, a team made of AAA gaming legends and blockchain developers. They were spun out of HBO. They've won a BAFTA, they've won Emmys, and 40 other entertainment awards. You'll recognize their work as it includes Halo, Call of Duty, BioShock, Westworld, and over 30 other titles, all while reaching over 100 million fans. They're building a competitive, multiplayer, first person shooter which allows you to create, trade, and own your own created content. If you're as excited to play this game as I am, then you're going to need to pick up an extraction pack, which is currently available on their website. So hop on in there, check them out, see if an extraction pack is right for you, and you can find them on shrapnel.com. Huge shout out to our sponsor, Playa3ull Games. They are inspired by gamers and funded by their community. They have a epic game on the Epic Games Store, a third-person shooter called Nexus. Hop on in there and check that out. They're also currently selling nodes, so if you're interested, check that out at their website, playable.games. That is a 3 instead of a B on Playable. Now strap in for the rest of this episode of Interlinked.
Today, we have a living legend in our space, Mr. Yat Siu. How's it going?
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and Happy New Year to all.
Happy New Year. As always, alongside of me, the absolute legend, Mr. Nick. How are you today, sir?
Doing quite well. Very grateful you've decided to join us today, Yat Siu, and a very happy new year to you as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure, a lot of people like to do the big brand introductions of you. And I feel like you don't really need an introduction anymore in the space. Obviously, you're one of the living legends here. But what I would love to really cover and touch on is a bit about the origin story of how you really got here. And specifically, I think what would be really powerful would be to talk about how you came to your thesis and conclusion about digital property rights and how that has kind of become a central point of what it appears to be of your thesis here. So maybe you can take us back in time and kind of bring us into the current moment from where you started.
Great. No, thank you for that. First, I think I probably am one of the more older people in the Web3 space. And that's only because of the fact that I'm a child of the 70s. And I think for me, the origin story really started that way. Although, of course, back then when I was a kid, I had no idea it would lead to where it is today. And I think it's a series of things that made me think about where the world is today. It started because I grew up as in a family of musicians in Austria, in Vienna. And so that part gave me sort of a little bit of an experience of what it's like to be in, I guess, its own microcosm of a creator economy. But what I actually really saw then was actually the abuse of creators. So I had a lot of empathy of what happened to my mom, in part because she didn't know anything about money. She didn't know how to negotiate contracts. She had no idea. She was an opera singer first and became an opera director. And it was sort of that experience of, her agents and her managers, and they're like, we'll take care of you. We'll take care of you. You don't have to worry anything about money. Don't worry about that, right? Just do art because you're supposed to be good at that, right? And by the way, we hear that story on and on again from agents today, when they were talking about that type of stuff. And of course, it led to a situation where she was dependent on them to the point where ultimately they just took advantage of her, right? And that's kind of one sort of story. It's an age-old story, but it's one that always exists because we intentionally sort of leave out the part of knowledge that's necessary for them to really become independent, right? Which is, again, one of the thesis points around why Web3 and NFTs in particular are so powerful. But then the other part of the story is that outside of the fact that I was, kind of forced to learn music just because my family was musical, was the fact that she also worked in the eastern side of Berlin, so East Germany. And I think, again, most people will not properly remember this because they're probably too young, right? But I used to cross the border to see my mom, and I would see what real communism is like. What happens in the world when you have no property rights. And again, as a child, I was impressionable, but I didn't really understand exactly what it meant. I just knew I didn't want to live in 1984, right? And then when I went over back to sort of my sort of like the Western side, then I would sort of experience sort of a social democratic world, which was capitalism light, shall we say, but generally still very socialist. And then through my work, ultimately, I started working for Atari. I basically came to the US, and then I experienced, capitalism in its fullest extent, right? And we're talking about 90s America. And even though it was a depression, people were very happy to still talk about money, right? You weren't shy about it, which has changed, which I think is a different flavor today. But back then, it was all about capitalism, which was a bit of a shock to me because in Europe, you don't talk about money, right? And I think for most, if it's Europeans on the podcast, they'll probably appreciate the fact that, it's something that is a little sort of ugly to talk about. You don't want to talk about sort of money and systems. They don't study it in school. Like none of that stuff happens. So you grow up rather ignorant, and therefore you don't appreciate, its potential, which is of course an issue because when you actually enter the real world, it's all about money, right? It's a critical part of living, shall we say. And then I came to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong, it's Milton Friedman's dream. It's like it's basically capitalism overdrive, right? Where when I came to Hong Kong, there wasn't even any social security whatsoever, right? So you would have literally 70, 80-year-olds still sort of carting sort of garbage up areas because that was the only way they could make money. And you had to, and I think Hong Kong is, was or may still be one of the worst sort of Gini coefficients in the world, right? Where, you have the Rolls Royces and Bentleys on one hand, and you'd have literally abject poverty on the other, despite its incredible wealth, right? So seeing all of that, right, and experiencing all of that sort of started giving me a view about sort of the benefits and the negatives and sort of how to sort of redraw some of that. But again, I didn't have a really sort of feeling about how to solve it. It was just something I experienced, which kind of, decades later would lead me to sort of our digital property rights sort of thesis and why that's so important. But then also how I entered technology. I entered technology through my, work with, basically writing MIDI software because, I wasn't a very good musician, so I had to cheat a little bit. So I ended up writing MIDI software that basically helped me sort of, achieve music creation faster and better than my peers at school. And, my teacher was absolutely unimpressed because remember, maybe you might not remember, right? But in the 80s, you couldn't even use a calculator in school for math. So then, let alone use a computer to help you with music composition. But I uploaded the software on this early form of, I guess, pre-internet called CompuServe. And at CompuServe, which was not yet connected to the internet, it was more like a bulletin board system. I met other people who appreciated my software, and they started sending me money because that's how it used to be. There was no PayPal. They just literally send you a check, and they're like, "Hey, we like your money. We like your product. Here's some money. Keep doing what you're doing." And then I would provide support online. And the way that it worked in CompuServe and later on Genie and AOL and so on was if you were keeping people online by sort of giving them support and maintenance, you would be paid a fee. So actually your online work was actually a sort of already being rewarded because there was some kind of value. So they wouldn't pay you a sort of a service subscription. Rather, their sort of billing time online would then cut a sort of revenue share back to you for having kept them online, so to speak, right? So that, because back then things were charged by the minute. So that sort of brought me there. And then Atari liked the software and they offered me a job, and I was still only a child at that time, which sort of was a different sort of perspective of it didn't matter how old you were. And, growing up in Austria as a Chinese person, basically as a minority, it was fine, except the fact that I was really, really, really a minority. There was barely any Chinese people in Austria. But because it was digital, it was online, it didn't matter who you were, where you're from, or even how old you were. If you knew how to do something, you had value and you had opportunity. And that's kind of how the web really worked, whether it's Web 1, Web 2, and also in Web 3, right? If you have talent, if you know how to do a smart contract, if you can trade NFTs, like whatever it is, doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter where you're from. You could be in Africa, you could be in the Philippines, you could be in America. You had opportunity, right? And that sort of opening and flattening of the world was really appealing. And again, I didn't feel it quite in that same sense in a sense that, I didn't think of it as philosophical as I do today. It was just more like, this is cool. I want to be a part of it. And I would say that's kind of the journey of how I entered into the, I guess what we call today the metaverse. But back then it was kind of virtual. I bought my first virtual sword, I think, in a multi-user dungeon, like a mud. I think it was either in 89 or 90, right? And I remember that experience when I sort of went and, bought it from this person. The transaction took 2 weeks because I had to send him a check. And then he had to clear the check. And then he had to basically, then we finally met. It was like, in this sort of, I guess, equivalent of some CD bar in the game. And then he would drop the sword, right? Because he can't give it to me. So I have to pick it up, right? Like it was, but despite the quirky and messy interfaces, people did it all the time because there was already some value in these game items. And that's why sort of when we talked about sort of part of the origin story, sort of when we discovered NFTs with CryptoKitties, which our studio was involved in, in Vancouver, we, it was just such a normal thing to us. Wait, yes, people of course want to have ways to own their game items, but they couldn't do that before because it wasn't allowed by the game company. But also you didn't have a way to make it interoperable. And when NFTs came about, it was like, wait, this is the moment, right? And the history of being in the video game industry, having experienced sort of gold farming, with World of Warcraft, having made apps on the App Store. I think this is probably one other story that is probably relevant is that, we're one of the biggest mobile game companies in 2011 and 2012 worldwide when the App Store was just emerging. And Apple deplatformed us. They just removed all of our apps, basically, literally sort of tried to kill the company. And, we will never fully know why that happened, except that they probably didn't like the fact that we figured out how to growth hack the App Store. Back then, it was pretty primitive. And if you remember back then, it was top 20, right? And by the way, Apple has since removed this type of ranking mechanism, if you noticed. And the reason they did that is because they thought that would pervert the App Store. But what they've actually done by doing this is they've removed the free market of the App Store, right? If you don't have discovery based on, how much people pay or how much people like it, for instance, as a free market element, then you can't have true discovery because you don't actually know what people really want. And as a result, today, App Store, the games on the App Store actually have no discovery and nobody actually tries to do marketing there. And if you go there, it's like the same 20 apps and it's the same stuff that they feature. But that's kind of, how Apple thinks about the world because they kind of want to be kingmakers, the whole editorial control. But anyway, we figured that out by simply doing cross-promotion. And, being enterprising, we thought, okay, well, we should cross-promote, but how do we cross-promote? Well, let's launch an app every week, right? And so, and on one hand, you could say, isn't that spamming the App Store? But we didn't spam it with the same apps. We created calculators, we created wallpapers, we created sort of, calendars, right? Like it's a small sort of, you could say sort of, whimsical apps that had some use, but that were maybe temporary, you could say, because, calendar was only useful a certain amount, or like New Year calendar or greeting cards or whatever you want to say. But then we'll promote sort of our main assets, which is our games, which led us to having hundreds of apps on the App Store in a really, really short period of time. And then one day it was just all gone. And that was something that led me to sort of really sort of think about the dangers of exactly being in the sort of centralized platform. And also the censorship element, because at the time when it happened, it was made headline news. We actually couldn't say anything. Because if we did, would they let us back in? What's the problem? So the sort of insidious thing about censorship isn't the fact that someone is telling you can't do it. It's the fact that you yourself are now actually creating your own form of self-censorship because you're doubting, you're in fear, you don't know what's going on because you have no rights. And this happens all the time, right? So it's a series of collection of experiences that kind of led us to where we are today, where when NFTs came out, my sort of, I guess, experiences and thoughts around, let's say, democracy and maybe and sort of capitalism, and then also the fact that we have to have full and free freedoms. Because the early form of the internet was about freedom, but it was a different kind of freedom. It was information freedom in a sense, right? But actually, we weren't able to capture the value of it. And actually, what's more powerful that protects it, sort of information freedom is actually our economic rights. Our property rights. Because as I get older, I also start thinking about sort of what, especially in recent times, the threats to our democratic institutions actually comes from the fact that we are threatening sort of the fabric of how we defend our property rights. For instance, this question around capitalism versus socialism is, I think, very, very dangerous. Because if we're willing to basically sort of encroach upon our property rights, and there's a balance, right? There's a balance. Some people say, okay, I want less, I'm happy to have less certain freedoms and rights in exchange for more security and safety, right? That's one element to look at it. And there's a pendulum between that. But if it shifts too far in a certain direction, where you have no property rights, where people talk about, for instance, well, your inheritance, we should take it away from you. That's a conversation that's happening right now, right? To me, which is crazy, which means that sort of the labor of yours, the ownership of your things, actually aren't really your things anymore. Well, then if that's the case, if I don't have security of owning something, a bank can't give you a mortgage. You can have capital formation. You can have value accrual on this type of stuff. And then if you actually don't have rights and ownership of your things, of your land, as it were, then how do you defend your democratic institution? What's the framework that says you have rights at all, right? So this is the powerful thing about the US Constitution, and also sort of many of the sort of first philosophies around sort of how to create that is from the fact that it stems from the very thing, which is the protection and the natural rights of the fact that we are entitled to our own property rights. And then in the digital world, actually, we don't have that, because you don't own your Twitter handle. You don't own your Instagram handle. They can take it away at any time, as we have seen, right, on time and time again. I mean, if Epic can't even launch their apps on, their game on the App Store, Epic, right? Then, what chance do much smaller companies and indie studios have to really do something? So really, it's become, we're sort of working for the platforms, which of course is against the interest of the market, because we're doing what they want us to do. We're not doing what we think should be done. All these elements, then you create these dictatorships, and then you create essentially also a way where value formation isn't possible. So that's the reason why NFTs, which is very difficult for people who don't get it to understand, have so much more value as an individual item than any game item in the world, because one of them is a property right, which you can have formation, which you can lend on, which can have network effects built on. It can be used in 20 different games, 30 different games. It could be used in Neo Tokyo or in Mochaverse or whatever, versus your Fortnite skin, which is cool, but you can only use it in Fortnite. And that's it. And if Fortnite closes, it's gone, right? And the crazy thing is that every gamer who probably plays Fortnite thinks he owns those skins. Nobody says, oh, I rented them, like you go to the prom night or something. Everyone thinks that they should be theirs. But because there's no framework where you can have network effects built on it, you don't have way of which capital can form. And I'll close with this thought, right? Which is, when you have property rights, it's the permissionless nature of people building on top of your property rights that actually makes it powerful. So, today you buy a car, and there are 1,000 network effects that make the car interesting and valuable. And one of the most powerful reasons why you buy a car isn't actually the fact that you can drive it. That's of course useful, but then we should be all driving newer versions of the Ford Model T, right? Black and utility, right? We drive it for our social identity, for what it says about us, right? I mean, people don't buy a Rolex to tell the time, right? And this is the part that often is misunderstood. And I often give this example between a Bored Ape and a Birkin bag. And for a lot of people, they still can't get it until I say, do you buy this Birkin bag so you can actually put stuff in it? And everyone goes, oh, yeah, actually, I don't, right? And how much of it, what you purchase in the world today, which is all culture and community related, is actually things that all talk about your identity, right? And so this is so critical to us. And our parents' generation, I think this is where we get influenced so much, where we still came from a time where we still had to fight for our basic needs, right? I mean, my parents, they moved to Europe because it was during the time of the Cultural Revolution, right? I mean, if you're an American, you would not have experienced this, but most people from Asia and Middle East and certain places around the world lived at a time where we had no property rights. We didn't have any of these benefits. And so it was utility for them. It was like, you have to be practical. Everything was around sort of the basic needs. But, these basic needs are all covered. We don't really have to worry about food or shelter. And so we go to the next stage, right? And the next stage is around what matters to us. And we go to love, sort of, and identity, individuation, whatever it is that you search for. The point being is that now we have the luxury to look at these things. And then this is why luxury goods are rising like crazy. This is why sort of things of consumer goods, how many different shoe brands are out there? Like, really, do we need, that many shoe brands in the world, or fashion brands, or jewelry brands, or whatever brand there is out there. I probably couldn't name, more than 1 or 2% of the world's brands out there that give us identity. That's because it's so important to us, because now we're at this point in life where we want to achieve those things, or when we search for mindfulness, or when we have tattoos or whatever. These are all points of self-expression, right? And the digital world is where we're spending most of our time. So it's natural to think that we want to have digital self-expression and have digital identities. But there's not ones that we could own until today. That's why it's so powerful. And so that was probably a really long-winded way of sort of our origin story. But anyway, thank you for indulging me.
Well, this is the beauty of the long form, is how we get to hear the full answer, which I'm deeply appreciative of. One question on that, because obviously, you've been through a lot of history, and I love how you're relating things that are happening now to things back in history. Based upon your study of that history and all of your experiences, talking about capitalism, democracy, socialism, fascism, all these things, what is the balance? Like, after all of the experimentations with economy and population and demographics and assets and digital property rights, what do you think, one, it should look like, and two, where do you think it ultimately will end up? Because those might be different things.
Yeah. So first of all, I think this is an ever-evolving sort of balance, shall we say, just because of the fact that humans are obviously dynamic, right? And I think this is the other important thing I think we should never forget, which is that whatever we do, we serve a human purpose. So when everyone's talking about AI and how it's going to change the world, by the way, I think AI and Web3 are going to supercharge each other. We can talk about that a little later if you want. But I think the point is that it's not an AI that looks at Midjourney's art and says, that's really beautiful, right? At the end of the day, it's a human that says, that's really beautiful, right? So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the experience is human. And also when we think about value, and when we think about money, and we think about even governments and democracy, these are actually stories we tell ourselves. They're just stories we agree on. So this is something unique to us as humans. We're the only species that actually live on stories we create ourselves. I mean, maybe dolphins do too, I don't know. But generally speaking, when we think societally, right, we have this ability to craft these stories and then create community around these stories and create meaning and purpose. And we live for that meaning and purpose, right? It's you might call it meme culture, for instance. But when you look at the American flag, at least in my generation, it meant something. It was like liberty and freedom, right? And it was it was these type of things that it stood for something, for instance, and therefore we are attracted to it. So we're no longer just attracted to just physically being in the land. Because when I first came to America, it was quite disappointing. Actually, it was fairly underwhelming. Right? It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But the idea of America never left me. Right? That was the part that. And by the way, that's what's spreading in the world. It's not sort of the experience of having been to America. It's the idea of what America represented, at least to a certain very large population in the world, and it inspired essentially people to think about democratic institutions and rights around that. But the evolution happens because things become more available and accessible, sort of whether it's information, whether it's resources, whether it's changes in economy, and so therefore I can't really say that there is a sort of natural sort of, let's call it, equilibrium that happens, other than the fact that we need to, I think we go back to some of the OG philosophers of our time. When you look at, for instance, like John Locke, which is really laid out, incredibly so, a foundation that led to things like the US Constitution, and sort of, led to sort of, basically what's happening in sort of French Revolution, all these things, where, I think, the whole idea of that life, liberty, and property are fundamental human rights, and that essentially he also broadly believed that man was good. So I think this is really important too, because other philosophers were arguing for centralized institution, like Hobbes would say, well, there are natural rights, but if we end up giving everyone sort of, let's say, basically sort of the state of nature as it described, it would be chaos, and we'd all kill each other, and it'll be all sort of like dictators and so on. So we need government to sort of step in and protect us. Whereas Locke's perspective was much more like actually it should serve the people, and that because people are intrinsically good and optimistic and positive, the people who are negative, they're exceptions, so we have to deal with them in exceptional manners. but because we all generally want to help each other and we're all generally nice to each other, which I subscribe to as well, then we can create a framework where we're entitled to these rights, to these natural rights. Right? And I think the phrasing, which is sort of fundamental here, is that every man has a property in his own person, right? And the labor of his body and the work of his hands are his, right? That's really sort of the framework, right? But in this age, what is labor? And I think this is the part that's changed, right? And so the way that we would express it is that the labor of our time is the work of our minds. It is no longer our hands, right? So we've now moved to a point where we're basically working on what's happening in here. When we're online, when we're engaging with our creativity, yeah, we're using our hands to type keyboards and give commands or whatever, but it's not the kind of labor that John Locke was imagining, because he didn't know what it was going to look like. But it's still our effort. It's still valuable. And that work of our minds is data. And that data created ChatGPT and Google and Instagram and everything that's out there. And even the game companies, by the way. I mean, with game companies derive all this value because 97 to 98% of the people play for free, which is apparently a cost. But if those 97, 98% of the people who basically don't pay anything, don't play, that 1 or 2% that drive the hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue won't pay, because it's like going into a chess game and there's nobody to play with. So we're the entertainment in the gaming world. And we've been cleverly tricked into thinking that, it's fun, it is, but that there's no real value going back to this other than entertainment. But in reality, and this is why Web3 is so amazing, we can now enumerate that value, right? So why blockchain and Web3, I think, creates this great equalizer and the free market environment is now we create a free market environment for our exchange of the value of our minds, which is data or data derivative, which means I can now say what it's worth. And intermediaries can come in and say they can do that. This is, by the way, what happened in the Web 1 with information. Oh, I know what the price of rice is now in America. So if I'm a rice farmer in China, I can now say, hey, you're charging $100 for, I sell it to you for $1. Wait, hold on, okay? I want more. And the thing is that because someone else knows this now, if that original sort of, I guess, agent won't do it for you, then someone else will come in and say, but I'll do it for you, because there's value and profit in the exchange of that. And this is what will happen with data on blockchain. Because if I can tell that you, as a gamer, can generate thousands of dollars of value for me by playing the game, because you bring people in, because you do stuff, then I'm going to pay you more to do that. And today we kind of do this when we look at followers on Instagram or on TikTok, on YouTube, and we say, oh, you have 1 million viewers or followers or something? I'll pay you some money. But we don't know if that's true. You could bot that. We don't know the background. We can't analyze it. So just because you have 1 million followers, I don't know how much money that generates. I don't know which games you're playing. This is intentionally kept obscure because people just want to keep shooting blanks. I mean, this idea that when you do advertising, you have a single-digit conversion rate, and that's supposed to be good. Like, imagine if you're running a restaurant or something and you basically get a 1% conversion rate, like you're bankrupt, right? I mean, it's ridiculous that we've been trained into thinking that that is a healthy conversion rate, that we should be okay with that. So all of this type of stuff is messing up because we don't have information parity. And so this comes down to, I guess, to your question, which is we create this equilibrium because there's a free market on the value of our minds. And if it's on-chain, on blockchain, it's transparent, we'll see it. So for instance, I'm playing a game and I know this game only makes $50, but I really love this game. I'm not going to demand $1,000 of work because I know what value there is, for instance, right? You can't take more than there is in the first place. It's the fact that I don't know how much you make, or I make assumptions about how much you make, or I make assumptions about how much you're worth, that as a result, we can't have a fair trade of value or a reasonable trade of value. And so I think this equilibrium will happen because we can have more transparency, which is really what Web3 does. And just imagine today in Web3, I can target every Bored Apes owner authentically. I can know what he owns or she owns. I can see the history. Did you ever trade your Bored Ape? What did you do with it? Are you a flipper? Are you a holder? And I can really give you something of value, which is how airdrops work. Did you trade NFTs and do you own it? That's a mechanism. And what that is really marketing dollars. But what you're doing is you're spending marketing on the kind of people you want to bring in directly, as opposed to shooting blanks in Google and Apple, who not only take all this value from you, they don't give back into the economy. I mean, does Google, like $110 billion was spent in CPA advertising and CPI type of advertising last year, between Google, Facebook, and all those guys. How much of that money goes back into the gaming industry? Close to zero, right? Outside of infrastructure and platforms, right? But if you give that same money to the actual gamers in the ecosystem, sure, some of them will cash out and they'll sell or whatever. That's your marketing cost. But there's a much higher chance of those people, especially if you target it appropriately, who say, oh, I really like that. Thank you for this. And I'll keep playing. I'll keep entering the ecosystem, which is why Web3 is so much more powerful.
And even the winners, I would argue, translate to marketing dollars, because what do those winners do? They go and tell all their family and friends where they won. And then those people are like, oh, Ben won, X playing this game. Like, what? Maybe I get involved in that space. So you at least get a return on that as well.
Exactly. It flips the whole advertising thing upside down. Well, actually, Web3 flips everything upside down, really. But in particular, I think this is a big threat to sort of, I guess, this targeted advertising component. But if you think about it, it goes back to the original promise of what advertising was meant to be online. Oh, I can know more about you. I can target you. I can sort of give you value directly, right? That's really what this was all about. And today, it almost feels like a billboard. In fact, ironically, a billboard might be cheaper than advertising on Google. I mean, that's how flipped it's gotten in terms of performance.
So I feel like we've established a really strong foundation of kind of where you came from, some base foundational beliefs here, which I think are very important, and I'm again grateful for that context. I really want to establish where, from your perspective, where are we now? Right, we're filming this at the beginning of 2024. We've had so many milestones thus far. Maybe you could help us understand in your mind what have been some of the most impactful milestones leading up to the beginning of 2024, and then help us kind of frame and understand where exactly we stand right now.
So first, I would say 23 was a cleanup year. And I think it was necessary. It was like a little bit sort of getting rid of all sort of skeletons in the closet, cobwebs and all that kind of stuff. I mean, first, when you think about what happened in the last 12 to 18 months, I would say very few industries go through the kind of trauma that our industry goes through and comes out the way that it does. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, Bitcoin was maybe 17 or 18,000 a year ago. Not quite sure, but anyway, right? And for an asset class of that magnitude to basically be, what, 44, 45,000, whatever the number is, and 1 year later is incredible, right? And we're still kind of in, I guess if I was to use parallels, kind of a gold age equivalent of sort of the digital economies. And Bitcoin is our digital gold. Right, in that sense that if Bitcoin does well, the entire industry does well. And it creates essentially all the financial infrastructure around it that basically gives it that support. And gaming was a very, very big beneficiary over the last 30 to 60 days, clearly, because I think people are now catching up to the narrative. But what happens is typically when you have a so-called stable foundation, then people can start thinking about the future. And I think that's exactly what's happening. So with Bitcoin and Ethereum and sort of the, let's call it foundational tokens, sort of having a stability layer, people feeling more confident about the future, they can now start thinking about what the future looks like, right? And so what does the future look like? Wait a second, Web3 gaming makes a ton of sense because all the people who are playing games will more naturally onboard into Web3 because virtual currency and tokens, skins and NFTs, right? These are all sort of very natural to think about, which is our original thesis point. And we've seen that cycle basically, when we're early investors in companies back then, like OpenSea and Axie Infinity, and of course on the Sandbox and so on, and all these institutions and companies actually rose really, really dramatically in sort of really 21 and early 22. But there was a shift in the audiences. So the audiences in 2021 were much more speculative in nature. And the reason is because they came from the original crypto world, which was very financial in nature. So I would say that Web3 was very Wall Street dominated. So it's a crypto Wall Street equivalence, right? They were there for the money, and that's understandable. But the vast majority of the world isn't actually looking at money as an end in itself. But that's some people. Most people look at money as sort of a way to get to their particular means, right? So money is a means to their end. And most of the ends are cultural in context, social in context, status in context. I want money to live somewhere for my family. I want money to be someone. I want money to show something. I don't want money for money's sake, right? And we had a lot of people in Web3 who were there for money's sake, who were just accumulating, as we saw. In the excessive side cases, and people like FTX were very much in that sort of uber greedy vein that weren't really thinking much about the consequences. And we don't have to sort of belabor that point, but the point is that that was sort of covered by that crowd. And I think their fall is representative of, I guess, a shift in industry of a sort of removal and cleaning up of those type of people, which are still there, right? But it's just that they're no longer the majority. And so when people enter in sort of, I guess, a bear market, which is 23, in the fields, whether it's NFTs or in tokens or in generally the Web3 ecosystem, in a bear market, most of them would be entering it in the belief of what it represents, digital property rights, freedom, or liberties, or whatever it is that they search for, which is a much more stronger foundation, right? And you see this, for instance, in the number of NFTs available on the secondary market. Like in Mochaverse, for instance, we have, I think 1% or 2% or some really low percentile of NFTs that are available in the secondary market. And that's not because people are just sort of hodling. It's because that people believe in Mochaverse for the long term of what they think will happen. And the kind of people who own it are actually people who have a long-term belief in it in terms of institutions and growth of what it is. And to me, it's a little bit like nation building, right? When you go into a new country, you have to invest and build into it. You don't have an expectation that magic will happen tomorrow, right? There's an investment involved and there's a holding in there, and it may not look most beautiful, but actually you'll be rewarded for being part of that community in the mid to long term, which doesn't always, by the way, have to be related in a financial manner. It's something that's about the community, because in Web3, of course, as we see all the time, if someone sells an NFT, it's like, hey, why do you sell the NFT? Like what do you do? Don't you love us anymore? Like, what's going on, right? Like there's actual kind of sort of social peer pressure that happens all the time in real life, except now it's amplified through the entire internet, where everyone can see you sold that NFT. Okay, and it's somewhere between sadness, maybe depression, maybe traitor, like whatever feeling you have around that, those classic human feelings are just amplified. So it's out there. And this is the thing about why I think NFTs are so much more powerful in that sense, is that we are social creatures as humans, right? And so we're bound by communities. That's who we are. And we're bound by these stories and these cultures. And NFTs are these digital stores of cultures, right? Because these stories are individual. That my ape has my own story, and I can never sell it, right? I mean, can you imagine what would happen if I actually sold my ape? There'd be all sorts of things going on around the world that I wouldn't be able to control that narrative. And that's true for, not physical items as well, right? It's just amplified in that manner. So that's actually sort of where we've gone through now in 23, where I think we've brought in a much more fundamental audience into the gaming worlds, into the NFT collections, even more so than I think the fungible tokens, which is also, I think, one of the reasons why NFTs broadly, in terms of return ratios, have really, really outperformed, I guess, many sort of, let's call them fungible tokens, even though they're more liquid, because the patterns of people who hold them is entirely different. And then you have some great revival stories as well. Like Pudgy Penguins is amazing what they've done, for instance, in terms of sort of bridging this stuff, right? And then, and of course, I talked about Mochaverse, but then you have also new projects that are all coming out on the Bitcoin ecosystem, which is also astounding. Like in what's happening with ordinals, and we're backing projects like with Life Beyond, and also On-Chain Monkeys is also one of our early portfolios. These are projects that didn't exist before because Bitcoin was unable, pre-inscriptions, to have a way in which you could store digital culture. And all the controversy, by the way, that we see, between people fighting internally in the Bitcoin ecosystem between, are inscriptions good or bad, is what we witnessed with CryptoKitties in Ethereum 5 years ago, right? It's exactly the same narratives. And you see this, but it's a necessary evolution because now Bitcoin actually has a use and there's a way in which that ecosystem has value. And I think it's contributed to the ecosystem because, of course, miners get paid and there's money there involved, and then they can reinvest and the economies start growing. So all of that is interrelated to each other. So I think we have a very good foundation, and I think 24 is going to be an amazing year for this. Also, knock on wood, I don't really see very potentially, very big black swan events, because I think, to me, for instance, the Binance settlement was huge because this created clarity in the market. Right? The market doesn't need very much, right? Even if the token prices are down and the economy, if there's clarity, they know what to do. The predictability right? And I go back again to this foundation of digital property rights or property rights in general. There may be many things that are unstable, but if you know you can own this for sure, you never have to worry that this house is your house, this car is your car, or this NFT is your NFT. Then that is that's stability, that's predictability. And from that predictability, whatever volatility sits on top, you can still build on top. If you own your house, you can invest in it, or you can live in it, or you can do something, right? It's the fact that you don't know what's going to happen. There's no predictability. You could lose your house anytime because government decides to, for instance, right? Then that type of thing creates massive instability and a lack of predictability, right? And it's difficult to create predictability all the way, because then then that's where you create sort of very tight controls where you basically absolutely have to sort of manage everything, and then you don't have freedom either, right? So it's this pendulum between the basis of having your protection of the sort of freedom of knowing what you have for sure, and then of course letting the market do its thing, where you have people not taking over those narratives. So it's somewhere. So it's again that pendulum between that. But I think we're at this point where we have a very stable, very stable, relatively stable foundation in terms of our industry. And I'm not sure exactly post the sort of ETF if Bitcoin will go up significantly or whether there's going to be a bit of a sell the news type of thing. But either way, I think it's established already a stable platform. And for us, basically, on the building level, build to build on top, I think gaming is going to very much lead the way in this year and bring in, I think, mass adoption.
I love that. I really appreciate again you kind of breaking that down for us and getting us very excited about moving forward into 2024. It's almost reminiscent in a way of when you have that stability, you can then use that to jumpstart. It's actually very reminiscent of when a small child is being raised, and you know that the most fundamental period of their life is between the ages of like I think it's 1 and 5 or maybe 2 and 5. If they've got that stability in that nurturing and that love, then they're going to have significantly higher self-esteem later in life. This is based on the science I've
Yes,
read,
yes. I have children, and I can definitely say that I think self-esteem is one of the most important things that you can give your kids, which is tough sometimes because the societal environmental pressures, schooling and that kind of stuff sometimes sort of point towards other directions because you have to be good at school or whatever. And I think schooling and education has tried to sort of fit us all into a box, even though we're very, very, very individual. I'd also add that, because I sort of experienced Web 1, there are many parallels between Web 1 and Web 3. Web 2 is actually, I think, the anomaly, but Web 1, the patterns as to why people joined Web 1 and why people sort of were building in it. And similarly, I mean, dial-up internet, people complaining about a MetaMask wallet. You haven't seen dial-up internet, right? You don't know what that looked like, right? And then they would go and see a website, that was either powered by Mosaic and then Netscape, and they're really primitive. I mean, you really could not imagine the use case. I mean, it was far, far worse than its experience that we're seeing today. And yet people still adopt it because they essentially had a sense of knowledge of what the future could look like. And that crowd, basically the early adopters, built the foundation of the early internet that then led to sort of foundational things like the sort of the massive growth of open source and basically eventually sort of these platforms that we see today. The difference though between Web 1 and Web 3 is the finance aspect. So in Web 1, it was all information, and so people could just enter, and even open source, right, which is an incredible source of value to the world, right? I mean, if it wasn't for open source, we wouldn't have Bitcoin probably, right? We wouldn't have many of the technologies we see today, AI and so forth. But because there was no exchange of value, it was a barter system, right? We're sort of at the barter age of sort of digital trade, right? I give you code, you give me code. I make code better, you take code. Right? Basically, I mean, that's basically where we emerge from, right? And in Web3, we can now embed value, right? And also I can track, oh, you contributed this, so I can give you this, I can do stuff for you. So we've basically moved essentially the internet from a barter age in which only a certain group of people, let's call them the kings and the sort of, I guess, shareholders, but whatever it is, right? The people who control the internet through their platforms could monetize, like a feudal age. to now essentially this moneyed age, right? Which is essentially where we are today. So I see the evolution of the internet very similarly to, I guess, societal evolutions. And so to kind of efficiencies that modern trade and money has done in the physical world, when you think of it in terms of what happened over the centuries, basically happening in a compressed time period in the digital space with Web3. And I think this is the part that when we had to move people from sort of, I guess, the physical world into Web1, there was an amount of education and literacy needed to do that, which I think is the part that we need to focus on a little bit in Web3. It's not the technical challenges; it's actually more related to the I would say the meta challenge of understanding sort of why am I here, right? And there's a clear correlation that if you are a Web3 onboarded person, you have an element of financial literacy. And by that, I don't mean that you are, Warren Buffett style investor, or that you're a total degen trader. I mean, it's somewhere in between, right? But you are comfortable with money. You're not scared by it. You understand about investing. You look at things from the lens of investing. You also know that if you're going to trade some meme coins, then probably you're just having fun, for instance, right? Like you have a certain kind of maturity around the space because you are somewhat financially literate and are growing into that, which is a problem because most of the world is not financially literate. We consider them included because of a bank account, but actually they know nothing about it. I mean, if you ask your friends who are not in the space, how many have a portfolio? Many of them might not have a portfolio. They might not even know what that is, for instance, right? And they would save money, literally. They would like, oh, I made some money, I'm saving it, like as if that's sort of the smartest thing to do over the last 10 or 20 years, for instance, right? And people still do that, right? And that's because they don't understand what it's all about. So to onboard them successfully into Web3, we need to also make them financially literate. When you think of what Axie did in the Philippines and why it has a loyal base, which then obviously supported things like pixels and so on, and the growth of the Ronin chain, it's because they onboarded millions of people who didn't even have a bank account into Web3, and they basically became a form of financially literate because they entered these new ecosystems that they couldn't access. So it isn't just about sort of banking them. It's the fact that they could now do stuff and have access to financial resources and means and things that they couldn't do before, which even in the more developed world, we sometimes exclude in the name of their protection, which is understandable. But on the other hand, when you go overboard with that protection, it's ironic that the very people who we want to include in the space, actually, we have now excluded because the qualifier is how much money do you have? So if I have a lot of money, then I can invest in all sorts of things. If I don't have money, I'm not allowed to invest in these things for your protection, right? And then we wonder why money itself in places like America in particular are starting to be viewed in a very feudal context. It's like, oh, if you have money, you can get everything. But if you don't have money, then you can't get access to a lot of things. And where does that lead? From opportunity and everything else around that. Ultimately, it leads to the kind of situation that we have in the US, sort of this inequity and all that type of stuff because of the relationship between labor and capital. But anyway, my point is that financial literacy and education in that area is really, really important. And I think to onboard people to Web3, we need to do a better job in onboarding them with the sort of idea of how to make them financially literate, because then they actually know why they're there.
Absolutely. I know that you're working on something in the education space that may be relevant here. Would love to touch on that, and then definitely want to get your thoughts on AI supercharging Web3. And I think that'll probably take us to about time.
Okay, great, wonderful. So with Open Campus, which is basically sort of powered by the EDU token, we launched essentially an education platform that allows people to build on top of the platform ways in which teachers can make more money, in which they create their educational content and then sell them as NFTs. Now, what's interesting, and this is again a powerful use case of NFTs, is that if I wanted to sell my intellectual property to someone, I can't do that unless it's worth a lot, because you have to use a lawyer, you have to do conveyancing, you have to do all that kind of stuff. So unless you make like at least tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, there's no point in selling it on and creating it as a capital asset. But as an NFT, you can do it if you only make tens of dollars a year, because the NFT represents your contract rights, where the money goes, everything in a single transaction. So even if you only make this content makes $100 a year, you could sell it for 500 or 1,000 for 10 or 20% yield. And this actually opens up basically this kind of capital formation, which we see in gaming assets in some form, not in the direct yield form, but in terms of, oh, this asset could be worth more because I can do more things with it. Therefore, there's a kind of capital formation that takes place. But with teachers, they create content that already generates income. Their English classes, their learning programs. And through this platform called TinyTap, which we acquired, there's about 7 or 8 million families using it, 100,000 teachers that are actively creating content, and they're now turning their content into NFTs. And many of these teachers who've sold these NFTs have made basically 6 to 12 months of their annual salary in a single sale, which they couldn't believe. But then here's the thing. If you give a creator money, they don't go out and buy a Lambo, right? They go build a business. They hire their friends. They go and expand the industry broadly and do stuff with it, right? Because they're value generators. And who are, if not teachers, who create actually some of those fundamental important values to our society? It's teachers. Probably our kids spend more time in school, probably many times than they spend with their parents, at least during the working days. So, and they're perennially underpaid. So again, that's a field which I think can really drive things in education. We talk about gaming being big. It is. It's a $200 billion space. But education is a $5 trillion space. And we do it all the time. When you think about even popular platforms like YouTube and TikTok, actually, what do? We're going out there and getting educated about things. If you want to learn how to do something, like open up your smartphone or like learn about something, you go on YouTube, right? So actually, education is everywhere. But those creators aren't getting rewarded appropriately. But essentially, with Open Campus and EDU, we're trying to do that. And of course, this is about laying the foundation, which includes financial literacy, because if we can teach people about the benefits of Web3 to teachers, then they can hopefully teach the children as to the value of this. And if we can teach algebra and math basically to kids, then we can certainly teach them about compound interest and sort of all sorts of elements of financial education, which I think will then change the world, because the best defense of any type of fraud, scam, and problems is actually being aware of them. And so if you are financially literate as a population, that's the way I think we inoculate against these kind of financial frauds. Like, we're creating all these guardrails because people don't know. But actually, if we know, I mean, this is what Web3 is so great at. If someone does a scam, nick, I mean, basically red alert, the community comes in, which actually will make law enforcement easier, right? Which is the other thing, right? And I guess once people understand this transparency framework and the fact that you have the world looking at you rather than just, the authority, actually creates not just a more democratic environment, but actually a much more safer environment, because everyone knows, but not in a kind of sort of Black Mirror way, because it's not one authority that is looking at all of this. It's a whole world that's sort of, keeping us accountable, right? So that's really attractive, I think. And I think this is what we're hoping to achieve with Open Campus and EDU. And I think, education is somewhat unsexy, because a lot of people left education to join the world. They're like, why am I going back to this thinking? But actually, it's so fundamentally important. I also think narratively, it's important, because when you think about education or even art or certainly finance, critically important things, it is hard because to appeal to, I guess, people not in Web3, that these are the reasons you should be joining Web3, because they look at these as vices, right? They look at Wall Street as a vice. They look at gaming as a vice a little bit, right? Even though I think gaming is important and we learn new skills this way. For like, we're not going to win the hearts of politicians and parents through these narratives. But education, giving more to teachers, getting more value for our students, that I think is a powerful narrative in which we can onboard essentially mind share in a big way.
Well, I think it's funny.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Well, what I think is funny is that gaming did get sort of a bad rep and isn't seen like a view of education, when the reason that we evolved play, why every single mammal from rats to humans plays, is for social bonding and learning.
Absolutely.
You watch a cheetah cub, it learns how to hunt by wrestling with its siblings in the savannah. And so I'd love to know how you're sort of weaving that into the education platform. Perhaps is there gamification for the teachers, or teaching them how to weave it in?
Yes. So when you look at TinyTap, that's creating essentially the platform to make these education NFTs. Actually, they're creating mini games, so it's interactive. And so when you're creating how you learn math or how you learn English or Chinese or whatever, actually you're creating a mini game, and that's actually what's so powerful. So it's a creator tool that could then sort of be published as an NFT. But also, I think for the game companies themselves, ultimately, game companies are creating platforms for education. I mean, if you think about sort of the things you learn in a game, the tutorials, so how you use a first-person shooter or so on, right? I mean, really, like who decided that WASD is actually the keyboard control of doing it this way, for instance, right? And who decided that jump is spacebar, a spacebar is jump, right? I mean, this now is lore. You can't change this. We've been educated that this is the way it goes. But actually, I don't know, maybe there's a better method around there. Point being is that we learn new skills, to your point, right? Through these social interactions, which basically is now become digital because we spend, in many cases, most of the time online. So I think there's a connection. But I think there's a difference between deliberate education and kind of sort of, I guess the fun and sort of engagement. You need both because there's certain kinds of knowledge that fundamentally still need to be brought into you. And we think that we still need to accredit for that because that's which Web3 is great for, because you can sort of rank them as well in terms of, okay, I know you know your math, or I know you know your stuff, which is, by the way, true for gaming as well. I know you're a good gamer. I know you can sort of, have really accurate shots and so on, right? These are all accreditations that now become valuable to you because I guess basically on chain. So yes, I totally agree with you. Probably don't have enough time to go into all of this, but there's a complete sort of interweaving of education and gaming, which is one of the reasons why we're so focused on it. And I think education in Web3, to me, feels like gaming in 2018, 2019. When we entered Web3 gaming in 2018, actually nobody believed in it. Everyone's like, gaming? Why would you do that? And that's because the audience wasn't from gaming. They were all financial in nature. So they didn't get it, right? And then of course, everyone's now into gaming and they understand it. And I think education is similar. Education is critically important. Look around you. But of course, because many of the crowd is quite young, they don't have children yet. So they don't necessarily think of why education is important until you have kids, for instance. Then you start saying, what do I do with my kids? How much money do you spend on your kids? How much money have your parents spent on you, for instance? And then people start going, oh, wait a second. This is actually really, really big, right? So your own personal life experiences is actually what shapes your thinking of the present. I think most people aren't naturally attuned to thinking about the future because most people aren't thinking about, okay, so yeah, maybe I want to get married, but I don't know who that is. And I'm not thinking about kids because until I have them, right? So these moments have to happen in their life first before they go. And so I think this is also where mass adoption comes in. When more and more people come in, it's not going to be just people who are young, which is the early adopter typically. It's going to be people who are older and who already have families or about to have families, or more importantly, the people who are in the space are now having families, right? And so this is to us a natural thing. So this is not, because we're not going to have less kids just because we're in Web3, right? In fact, I see a lot of people now actually having families sooner in this because they have a form of financial freedom. They can afford to do it. They're like, oh, actually, now I can start thinking about this stuff. I don't have to sort of start thinking about, building a family when I'm in my 30s and 40s because I actually can do this earlier. So, but it's this natural evolution that you're sort of moving into. It's just that you have to witness it yourself first before you actually see it in many cases.
What's interesting too is that, at least according to research by Ray Dalio, who I think is way smarter than myself, education is I think it's one of 7 or 8 leading indicators of the strength of an empire
Yes,
and a global dominant power. So when education increases, all of the other factors increase, secondary or tertiary
absolutely.
after education. It's kind of one of the
Absolutely.
leading indicators. So
And
it's
it's also
interesting.
the foundation and the defense of our institutions. So the fact that we have very high education is the reason why the democratic institutions can exist the way that they do. Imagine if America was very illiterate, for instance, right? And didn't have education. Then actually the only way to rule the country would be through a king, right? And you wouldn't actually have the kind of sort of, democratic institutions that you have in place. As much as they're being challenged, you have the counter challenge because of people who are educated in space, who have knowledge and that kind of stuff, right? But of course, you have to advance that. And what's happening now is there's a bigger gap in terms of knowledge and money as well. Because of course, if you have money, you can have access to more knowledge, right? And that's basically the problem that's been created. And again, this can be democratized in this space, and we're moving towards that area as well. But I guess what I'm just saying is that there's a clear correlation. And the metaverse is like a new economy. And if you want to make the metaverse essentially sustainable and strong and valuable, then we need to also increase its education and bring in the audiences who are there for the culture and the understanding of it, which comes from education and learning.
Definitely. Yeah, it seems like an amazing onboarding tool as well to help the world and normalize the idea of gaming when everything's more gamified. So it seems like it's a very powerful loop. Okay, I absolutely love the education piece. I know that we're short on time here, but I really, really, really would love to get your thoughts on AI supercharging Web3, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah. So first of all, when you think about AI, what we believe in the future will happen is that AI is, these autonomous agents of AI are going to be sort of traveling around independently, doing the stuff that you might have asked them to do, but they're going to be operating 24/7. And that's basically what Web3 is about, because if it's on chain, it can operate 24/7. And AI is essentially a digitally native sort of construct that exists best in a digitally native environment, which is basically Web3, right? I mean, in some ways, like you don't have like opening hours in the web per se, right? You have to exist in that manner. And also, when you think about what type of AI is most of the world engaging in, actually, it's NPCs. And we don't think of it normally as it, because they're so dumb and they're going to just tell us, where to shop and do stuff. But it's a basic form of AI that's telling us how to direct ourselves in the game. And when we interact with them, with the billions of users, more than OpenAI, for instance, in terms of what we do every day. And what we think will happen is that, because of LLMs and because of the technology of AI, these NPCs will become basically sovereign in their own way and independent in their own way and basically autonomous. And they'll start traversing and moving around different environments. So in other words, an NPC in one game can move to another game. In fact, we might want that, right? And they'll start trading with not just you, but other NPCs out there. And of course, what are they going to be trading with? They're trading crypto, right? They're going to open a bank account. They're not going to have PayPal, right? They don't have an identity, right? So they're going to be basically trading with each other already and doing stuff. And they're going to do it at the kind of speed that humans can't anyway, right? And so imagine millions of AI agents trading with other millions of AI agents, sort of doing our bidding and our work and our philosophies, whatever we tell them to do. And then, we engage with them and interact with them like our advisors. Like, I don't believe there's going to be one AI we're going to be using. I believe that, just how we have sort of running a company, we're going to have dozens of AIs working for us in their particular fields of expertise. I also think AI is going to be cultural in context, right? Meaning that they're going to mimic our belief systems rather than they're just going to be doing the most efficient thing, because that's not how we operate, right? We invest and do things because of what we believe in the world. We're not going to invest and do things just because of the mechanics of it, right? Which is, I think, often people try to find the formula, but then it sort of goes all wild and weird because human nature is not a formula in the classic sense. I mean, there's a thing called chaos theory for a reason, right? We have things that are sort of random around it. And that randomness is our belief system often, and the stories we tell each other. And that will be embodied by these AI agents that will go around. And that's why, I don't believe in a homogeneous environment where, okay, because if AI is going to run the world, we're all going to think the same, we're kind of group think, we're going to do the same thing. No, not at all. I think it's going to be quite different. There's going to be a diversity of these AIs because we fill them with our values, our belief, our knowledge. And they're going to do their thing based on what we ask of them to do or how we interacted with them. And this will just basically sort of bring out essentially our, I guess, identities of some form, but in a 24/7 way that they can do that we can't. And the only way to do this is in Web3, because that's the only way in which you can have interoperable assets go around trading in crypto, doing the stuff that you do. Because there's too much friction if you don't have Web3. Right? You'd have to like sort of negotiate the AI with the APIs. You have to open up these platforms. Like, it just can't happen unless it's on chain. And that's how I think is going to sort of really, really supercharge basically the entire sort of Web3 space. And I think, in Asia, where Web3 is very welcome and NFTs, people love it, and the growth has been amazing here. I think that connection seems very obvious because we're not trying to separate them. But in America, because of the historical narrative, especially around sort of Web3, because of all the scandals, there's been a distinction made, which I think is unfortunate, where people say, I'm focused on AI, but I'm not focused on Web3, right? Somehow, as if they are different, right? And to us, it's almost like saying, well, I don't really care about NVIDIA, even though I really care about AI. Like, they're so intertwined to each other. They're part of it's a base platform layer that will sort of supercharge AI. And that's why, by the way, Web3 becomes so important, because our identity layer, like why we're focused on identity on Mochaverse, for instance, is going to be driven by the authentic self. Like, who are you really and what have you done? Because in AI, you can't do that through really a passport photo or a driver license. Like, that's not a defense anymore of your identity, because that can be forged so easily. If we think our voice and our faces are actually the ways in which we can do our identity, we are mistaken in the age of AI. I think we can see this trend already. So that's why you need blockchain. That's why you need basically soul-bound NFTs and ways in which you can identify history and also audit that history to say, okay, you're not just this user because the blockchain says so. I can look at years of your history on chain to verify whether you are that person or not in an instant, as opposed to just basically saying, I am who I am because of a government issued ID that was issued last week.
Can't add anything to that. I think that's incredible. I mean, well said. Well said. Yeah, I just want to thank you again so much for coming on the show today. Kind of just want to hand it back to you and ask, is there anything else that you think we should have covered or that you would have liked to have covered or that we should have asked but we didn't think to ask? Maybe let us end on that note.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I would say one of the really exciting things that we find at Animoca Brands about Web3 is the ability to help sort of shape an environment in a manner that we think could really be better for the world. And I know it sounds corny and stuff like that, but I really believe that. And that's because we can now reframe something really fundamental around our property rights, which of course is capitalism. Right? Capitalism is the lifeblood of, not just America, but I guess our democratic institutions. And it's the defense of our liberties and our property rights, right? We won't be able to have that if we didn't have functioning capitalism. But because capitalism has gone unchecked in such a really bad manner and sort of dominated and monopolized, we've created these frameworks where even in America, it's crazy that even in America, there are more and more people who think capitalism is a bad idea. And I think that's really dangerous. And we see this in the hallmark of your politics, for instance, where people are trying to sort of, go against the principles of that. And I think Web3 can actually shift that narrative. So it's greater, like the move to Web3 is bigger than just financial inclusion and just about sort of, it's fun and you can make money and so on. I mean, that's often sort of maybe what you see short term. The foundation of Web3 is these digital property rights, is the fact that we can all become stakeholders in the networks we contribute in, which means we all become owners in the system, not equal owners, but owners, which means you all get to benefit in the work of others, which actually I think, interesting enough, ties us together. And we can see this, what happens in blockchain. If you own a bit of Ethereum, or if you own a bit of Solana, right, or you own a bit of Ronin, we're all in it together now. We all want to help each other out. And this idea of the zero-sum outcome of I will beat you, I will win against you, goes away. There's a little bit of the chain wars that happens in terms of, Solana versus Ethereum, fine. But within these ecosystems themselves, we're all basically community rooting for each other, which is kind of what's needed. We're losing that because of the inequity that's caused through this classic older broken form of shareholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism, which is, I think, what's possible with Web3, because we all own pieces of it, big or small, I think will solve that and will sort of reinvigorate and sort of reimagine and give hope as to what capitalism gives us. Because that's the other thing. As a nation, as an economy, as a community, if we don't have hope, you have nothing, right? And what's the most powerful thing that America has always given to the world and to themselves is hope. You had a hopeful generation. You could make it. You could do stuff, right? And today, I would say a lot of young people in America don't have hope. They don't know what their future looks like. I can't do anything anymore, it feels like. So it's all pointless. So let's just take it away instead. Let's look at socialist systems. That seems okay, for instance, right? And I think Web3 will solve that because, again, money and value will no longer be concentrated just in Silicon Valley, for instance, right, where people are in tech can make money, but actually give to everyone because you just need to own a stake in this one. And you see this spread the rest of the world. I mean, VC funding going into Philippines and into Vietnam, into Southeast Asia from American companies, that would have never been imaginable, say, like even 10 years ago. And today that's possible, but it's only in Web3 companies. So Web3 is really, I think, a great equalizer. I think it's the defense of, I guess, modern capitalism, I would say, because it can spread that form out there. Digital property rights is the new land because it's not really claimed by anyone per se, right? It's not, maybe it's hard to buy land in New York, but you can get into the virtual space. You can enter, you don't have to go to Mars. You've got this whole virtual world that is there for you to claim, to literally go and explore sort of these new worlds. And that's kind of what the metaverse means to us. It's this new, it's the exploration age as we are right now, and everyone should join it as quickly as they can so that we can create this kind of new balance in this new world, which will be better and fairer for all. Like I really believe that, and I think everyone working in the Web3 space is moving towards this greater goal, whether we know it or not.
Oh, I love it.
Well,
What a great way to wrap up this conversation. A fine exclamation point. Thank you again so much for sharing your knowledge with all of us. I know I learned a ton and look forward to listening to this on the back end. But yeah, ending on hope. And to the audience, we will see you next week for another episode of Interlinked.
Thank you for having me.